lantern was found half buried in river silt, its brass eaten by rust, its glass cracked in a spider web of fractures. Yet the faintest residue of soot clung to the wick, as if someone had extinguished it only moments before their disappearance. Sheriff Roland Pike had followed the rumors to the edge of the Tallapoosa River, expecting to find nothing more than a scavenger's trinket. Instead, he uncovered a second object, a child's slate board, the surface etched not with arithmetic drills, but with symbols he could not recognize. Long spirals, impossible angles, a series of numbers repeating like a fevered chant. The board was still warm. Pike felt it before he noticed the other thing, the indentation of a small body in the mud, as though someone had lain there, pressed down by invisible hands. No footprints leading in, none leading out, only that silent outline and the river breathing its low, indifferent murmur. He didn't yet know the name Caleb Johnson. He didn't yet understand the terrors that would follow, but he whispered to himself, voice trembling, "Lord, help us. The stories were true." Before the slate reached Montgomery, before the newspapers tasted blood and intellect in the same headline, a darker question had already begun circulating among officials who preferred dim halls and closed doors. How could a child vanish without trace? And what mind had drawn those symbols no scholar dared interpret? This is where our chronicle begins, with a boy whose brilliance unsettled even the era's most hardened rationalists, and with a disappearance that forced Alabama's most powerful families to intervene, quietly, brutally, permanently. Before we continue with the story of Caleb Johnson, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1859, and Alabama was a land balanced uneasily between the ordinary world and something older, something that whispered through pine forests and drifted along muddy roads at dusk. The air carried the weight of late summer humidity, that heavy perfumed thickness of jasmine, wet earth, and the smoke from hearth fires. Towns lay scattered like lonely outposts, each one wrapped in the uneasy quiet that comes before national upheaval. Conversations in taverns hovered between cotton prices, local gossip, and the distant rising thunder of political fracture. Yet beneath these daily worries was another tension, something people felt, but rarely named. The country stood at the brink of civil war, but nobody living in those towns yet knew which spark would finally ignite the tinder. What they did know was the rhythm of life as it had always been. Fields stretching wide under a brutal sun, wooden porches creaking beneath rocking chairs, church bells echoing across Sunday mornings. For many, faith was the only compass they trusted, yet even that compass seemed to quiver when talk turned toward the unusual child living on the Johnson farm. Caleb's world was one of red clay roads and hand-carved church pews, of cotton gins thundering at dawn, and cicadas humming madly at dusk. In the town of Ashford's Crossing, little more than 20 buildings pressed along a single dirt road. The smell of smoked pork mingled with horse sweat and wood tar. Women carried baskets from market stalls. Men exchanged news while adjusting their suspenders or wiping the grime from their hands. Children ran barefoot past the general store, laughing or shouting as dogs barked after them. Yet the Johnson property stood slightly apart from town, its fields bordering the dense woods that locals called the Shaded March, a name that felt old even then. People claimed the march never lost its mist, not even in the merciless heat of August. Travelers said they heard strange harmonics drifting from within its foliage on windless nights, tones resembling neither music nor animal cry. The older residents dismissed such talk as frontier superstition, but still no one willingly crossed into those woods after sunset. It was in this shifting, uneasy environment that Caleb Johnson's uncanny intellect began to attract attention. Long before the slate was found near the river, whispers had spread from the Johnson farm to the church pews and then to neighboring counties. Some said the child learned to read before he could speak full sentences. Others insisted he possessed what the preachers called the dangerous sight, an ability to understand things no child or adult should. Many dismissed the tales as exaggerations, the usual gossip about a bright young Negro boy living in a time that afforded him few avenues to showcase his gifts. But gossip has a way of sharpening into something far more sinister once fear and fascination intertwine. America in 1859 was a nation straining at its seams, and the South was a world desperate to maintain an order already cracking beneath its own contradictions. Spirituality mixed with superstition. Science floundered against the unknown, and even the educated elite carried charms or quoted scripture when confronted with phenomena they could not explain. In towns like Ashford's Crossing, that tension was always close to the surface, humming just under routine like a distant swarm, waiting to erupt. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty, political, spiritual, and deeply personal, that Caleb's story unfolded. Not merely a tale of genius, nor of disappearance, but of how a community already trembling under the weight of its own fears reacted when confronted with a mind that should not have existed in their understanding of the world. A story of how brilliance, in the wrong era and the wrong skin, became not a blessing, but a threat. And when that threat seemed to grow beyond what anyone could contain, desperation paved the way for the horrors that followed. Caleb Johnson was born in a single-room cabin at the edge of the shaded marsh, a place where mist clung to the treetops, and the soil felt unnaturally cool even in the burning heart of a summer. His mother, Eliza, often said the night of his birth was too quiet, so quiet the crickets seemed to hold their breath. She remembered the midwife, old Grandma Hester, pausing mid-prayer, her weathered fingers hovering over the newborn's forehead as though she feared to touch him. "Child's eyes ain't right," Hester whispered. "Ain't wrong, neither, just older than he ought to be." Eliza would hush her sharply, clutching the swaddled infant close. "He's mine," she said, "and he's fine." But Hester only shook her head, muttering to herself, "Fine just means the river ain't risen yet." Caleb grew faster in mind than in body. By age 3, he silently traced letters in the dirt behind the cabin, letters he'd never been taught. By 5, he was found arranging small stones in patterns his mother could not decipher, circles within circles, lines branching out like roots, the designs disturbingly precise. When Eliza scolded him, he'd only tilt his head in quiet confusion. "I just wanted to make the world look the way it speaks," he'd say softly. At first, she laughed at that. Later, she wept over it. Caleb's appearance was unremarkable to an untrained eye. Thin, long-limbed, with an almost fragile delicacy. His skin was the deep bronze of fertile soil, his hair tightly curled, and his gaze. That was the part that people remembered most. His eyes carried a strange mixture of innocence and calculation, as though he saw every person, every object, every gesture, and weighed them against some unseen measure. When he focused on someone, they often looked away first. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was the faintest lift of one corner of his mouth, an expression that made adults uneasy because it did not feel like a child's smile at all. Yet he was polite, preternaturally so. "Good afternoon, Mr. Callahan," he would say to the blacksmith, voice soft but sure. "The heat of the forge doesn't trouble you today." Callahan once confided to the preacher that he did not know what unsettled him more, the boy's manner of speaking like someone grown, or the fact that he always seemed to know what a man had been worrying about before he himself said a word. "He looked at me," Callahan said, "and spoke as if he'd walked through the corners of my mind before stepping into my shop." Caleb's father, Isaac Johnson, was a practical man, quiet, broad-shouldered, and deeply loyal to his small family. He worked long days clearing fields for the local land baron, Nathaniel Corbett, speaking little and observing much. He treated his son's gifts with cautious pride. "He's clever," Isaac would say whenever neighbors pressed him. "Ain't a crime for a boy to be clever." But when no one was listening, he admitted to his wife, "Sometimes I see him looking off, north or south, like he ain't standing where we are, as if he's listening to something we can't hear." Eliza tensed whenever her husband said things like that. She loved Caleb with a ferocity that bordered on fear, but even she recognized there were moments, small, flickering moments, when the boy's presence felt like standing too close to a thunderstorm. One night when Caleb was 7, she found him sitting awake on his straw mattress, staring at the wall as though watching unseen shapes crawl across it. "Caleb," she whispered, "why aren't you sleeping?" Without turning, he murmured, "They don't stop talking, Mama, not even when I close my eyes." "Who doesn't stop talking?" "The numbers." He said it with a calm certainty that froze her blood. After that night, Eliza prayed more often. Another figure of importance, though none could guess it at first, was Sheriff Roland Pike. A man in his early 40s, with a face chiseled by long days and a conscience weighed down by longer nights, Pike prided himself on being grounded, rational, and utterly unimpressed by rumor. He walked with a slight limp, the result of an old injury from a bar brawl gone wrong, and carried himself like a man who had learned to distrust both people and miracles. Pike first met Caleb after Isaac insisted the boy was being harassed by older children in town. And though the sheriff kept his distance, he later confessed to a colleague that meeting the boy felt like standing in a room too cold for its own fire. He remembered bending down so he could meet the child's gaze. "Son, was anyone bothering you?" Caleb regarded him carefully. "They were frightened," he said. "That is not the same thing as bothering." Sheriff Pike blinked. "And frightened by what?" "You already know," Caleb replied quietly. "You felt it when you stepped near the march." Pike straightened slowly, uneasy despite himself. "What do you mean I felt it?" The boy simply looked past him, toward the woods, then back again. "You're asking the wrong question." Pike never forgot those words. Nathaniel Corbett, the land baron who employed Isaac, completes the trio of adults whose lives would become entangled in this mystery. Corbett was a man of influence, wealthy, educated, and feared, whose home towered above the town like a remnant of some old southern dynasty. He disdained superstition, prided himself on rationality, and maintained strict control over the local economy and politics. Yet he had heard rumors about the Johnson boy long before he saw him. A child with a mind like a blade. A child who once corrected a traveling preacher's sermon with flawless citations of scripture he'd never been taught. A child who solved a merchant's ledgers in minutes after the man struggled for weeks. Corbett dismissed these tales as exaggeration. People loved to mythologize what they didn't understand. But when Isaac once brought Caleb along to deliver tools, Corbett found himself staring into the eyes of a child who seemed to notice every detail of the room. The ledgers on the desk, the wine glass half full, the creaking of a floorboard 2 rooms away. "You have a keen mind, I hear," Corbett said, only half teasing. Caleb blinked once. "You're afraid of losing your position?" Corbett stiffened. "What position?" "The one you pretend not to care about. The one that will be taken when the letter arrives tomorrow." Isaac clapped a hand over his son's shoulder, whispering sharply, "Caleb, mind your manners." But Corbett's face had turned pale. The next morning, a letter from Montgomery arrived on his desk, a political demotion he had not expected. After that, Nathaniel Corbett began to take a more deliberate interest in the child, not out of wonder, but out of fear. These were the people who surrounded Caleb Johnson in the months before the incident at the river. A mother torn between love and dread. A father wrestling with forces he could not name. A sheriff who wanted truth but doubted its shape. A land baron who would do anything to maintain control. And at the center of it all, a boy whose brilliance grew sharper, stranger, and more hazardous with each passing day. Soon the town would whisper not just about his intellect, but about the shadow it cast. It began with the quiet things, those subtle disturbances that only the most attentive souls notice before the rest of the world catches up. In Ashford's Crossing, people first felt the change in the air long before they spoke of it, as though the atmosphere thickened around their lungs at certain hours, especially near the woods that bordered the Johnson farm. Dogs, once rambunctious and eager to chase wagons down the road, began to cower as dusk settled, their ears folding back, their bodies trembling at shadows no one else could see. One evening, Mrs. Lorraine Fletcher insisted she heard a child crying behind her barn. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. A low, rhythmic sobbing, rising and falling with the cadence of breath. When she convinced her husband to investigate, lantern in hand, they found nothing but the sway of high grass. Yet she swore the crying ceased the moment she rounded the corner, as though it had retreated deep into the march. "Some fox making tricks of sound," her husband said, but the look she gave him said she didn't believe it. The rumors grew stranger. A group of field hands claimed that when they walked home past the Johnson property, they occasionally spotted a strange glow between the trees, pale blue, hovering low, pulsing like a heartbeat. They dared each other to follow it, but none ever stepped off the path. Not after the night old Mr. Darrell Young went missing for hours and returned shaken, unable to speak, staring at his own hands as though they were foreign to him. When his wife pleaded, he whispered, "The numbers don't stop once they start. They follow you. They cling." Yet the most unsettling events always seemed to orbit around Caleb. A teacher at the small mission schoolhouse, Miss Margaret Davies, a stern woman with gray hair pulled tight into a bun, reported that during a lesson on geography, Caleb abruptly stood from his bench and stared toward the back wall, his eyes unfocused, his body rigid. "What is it, Caleb?" she asked, assuming misbehavior. "There's someone outside," he said. Davies frowned. "No one is outside. Sit down, please." Caleb didn't move. His small voice trembled, though not with fear, more like recognition. "He's looking for the door, but he doesn't know which world he walked out of." Miss Davies felt an unexpected chill crawl across her arms. "Caleb, enough." He finally blinked, then turned and sat down. But that night she barred the schoolhouse door with an extra plank. Reports like this continued, scattered and whispered, until they reached Sheriff Pike's ears. At first he dismissed them as town anxiety. Farmers drank too much, mothers worried too easily, and old folks saw ghosts where there were only shadows. But the sheriff had never forgotten that day Caleb seemed to know the woods through him, as though reading from a page he hadn't shown. Still, it was the Johnson family who witnessed the earliest unmistakable signs that something encroached on their lives. Isaac often woke before dawn to begin work, leaving the cabin in a haze of morning fog. One morning he noticed fresh carvings in the wood of their front door, small vertical slashes, evenly spaced, too precise to be claw marks. He stared at them for a long time before touching the surface. The cuts were fresh, not even a day old. "Eliza," he said later that morning, "did you mark the door for any reason?" She shook her head, worry knitting her brow. "Why would I mark our own door, Isaac?" He hesitated. "Then who did?" That same week, Eliza woke in the dead of night to the sound of whispering. The voice was soft, childlike, but not Caleb's. It seemed to echo from beneath the floorboards. She sat up, heart hammering, listening as the whispering grew clearer, like someone reciting a series of numbers in an endless loop. 7, 9, 7, 9, 7. She leaned over Caleb's bed, fearing he might be murmuring in his sleep, but he lay still, breathing evenly. his lips unmoving. When she told Isaac, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were dreaming, Eliza. The mind conjures nonsense in the dark." But that night he lay awake, ears straining for sounds he couldn't admit he feared to hear. People in town soon began to claim that Caleb's presence changed the behavior of their clocks. The blacksmith, Callahan, swore his wall clock paused for nearly half a minute the moment the boy walked into his shop one afternoon. A traveling preacher passing through Auburn said his pocket watch began ticking backward after Caleb asked him why he'd been forced to leave his previous parish, something the boy couldn't possibly have known. Just a coincidence, Sheriff Pike insisted when the stories reached him. But the sheriff couldn't ignore a stranger detail. On an early October morning, just as the fog curled low along the dirt road, Pike encountered Caleb sitting alone on a fallen log near the river. The boy was drawing in the dirt with a stick, symbols Pike couldn't identify. Not letters, not numbers. More like a system belonging to a language no human should know. Pike cleared his throat. "You all right, son? You out here all by yourself?" Caleb didn't look up. "No one is by themselves," he said. "Not here." "Your mama know you're wandering off like this?" Caleb finally turned, meeting the sheriff's eyes. "Do you still hear the river's voice at night?" Pike froze. "Boy," he whispered, "I never told a soul about that." Caleb returned his gaze to the dirt. "I didn't say you told anyone." From that day on, Pike began carrying his revolver more often, not out of fear of violence, but because he craved the comfort of something solid and earthly in hand. By late autumn, the whispers of Ashford's Crossing grew into something heavier. The strange blue light appeared more frequently. Dogs refused to go near the march. Families began locking their doors before sunset. And then, the slate board was found by the river, warm, etched with symbols. The first undeniable sign that things in Ashford's Crossing were shifting from unsettling to catastrophic. Fear had a way of creeping quietly into Ashford's Crossing, like dampness settling into the foundation of an old house. It began with uneasy glances, with adults pulling their children closer, with lamps burning later into the night. But before long, it grew louder, spoken aloud in whispered arguments, in quavering testimonies at the church, in the frightened confessionals that found their way to Sheriff Pike's ears whether he wanted to hear them or not. The finding of the slate changed something. It wasn't just the strange symbols carved into its surface or the unnatural warmth clinging to it. It was the sense, palpable, chilling, that Caleb had been standing there moments before, and that whatever stood with him had not left the same way. Pike placed the slate in his office, locked inside a drawer, but he could swear he heard a faint tapping sound whenever he stepped too close to it, like something inside was continuing its work. He didn't tell anyone that part. On the morning after the discovery, he went straight to the Johnson cabin, his boots sinking into the damp, mist-laden soil. Eliza met him at the door, her face pale, eyes rimmed red. "You found something, didn't you?" she said. Not a question, an accusation, quiet but sharp. Pike removed his hat. "Your boy wasn't home last night?" Eliza's breath hitched. "I know. Why didn't you come tell me?" "Because I didn't know which truth you'd believe," she whispered, "and which you'd call madness." Pike stepped inside, the scent of smoke and boiled corn lingering in the cramped space. Isaac stood by the table, hands clenched, jaw rigid. "Where's Caleb now?" the sheriff asked. "We don't know," Isaac said. His voice was hollow, scraped thin. "But he's come home before after wandering. Always found his way back." Pike hesitated. "Has he ever stayed gone this long?" Eliza lowered her gaze. "No." Isaac met Pike's eyes, something dark flickering behind his usual composure. "Sheriff, you got something you ain't telling us." Pike swallowed. We found his slate down by the river. Eliza collapsed into a chair, covering her mouth. Was there blood? Isaac asked. No, Pike paused. Not blood, just markings. The couple exchanged a look, fear, resignation, and something like an old, unspoken dread. Isaac stepped closer to Pike. Sheriff, you ever heard of a haint that takes the shape of numbers? Pike frowned. Isaac, what? But before he could finish, a sharp rap sounded at the door. All three stiffened. Pike reached for his revolver. Outside stood Nathaniel Corbett. His fine coat was unbuttoned, his dark hair slicked back, his expression grave. Behind him lingered two men Pike recognized from Montgomery, state investigators, the kind who never traveled without purpose. Pike, Corbett said smoothly, we need to speak. Isaac stepped forward, blocking the entrance. You got no business here. This is our home. Corbett's lips tightened. Isaac, I'm sorry for what your family has endured, but this matter concerns more than just your boy. Eliza rose shakily. What's that supposed to mean? Corbett exchanged a brief glance with the investigators, then said, The governor's office has received reports about incidents involving your son. Pike bristled. This is my jurisdiction, Corbett. Not anymore, Corbett replied, his calm voice holding an unmistakable edge. Not when the state believes the child may pose a threat. Eliza let out a strangled sound. A threat? He's a boy. He's a boy who writes languages no one has taught him, Corbett said. A boy who knows things he shouldn't. A boy who, he hesitated, predicts things. Pike stared at him. Predicts? Corbett's jaw tightened. My demotion, among other things. Isaac muttered a curse. And now you're afraid. That's what this is. Corbett didn't respond. The investigators stepped around him, entering the cabin without waiting for invitation. We need to search the premises, one said. No, Eliza snapped. You're not tearing apart my home like we're criminals. Pike raised a hand. Hold on, all of you. Let's think this through. But the moment was broken by a sudden clatter from outside, the slam of the barn door against its frame. Everyone froze. Pike drew his revolver. Corbett stepped back. Isaac and Eliza whispered their son's name simultaneously. The sheriff gestured for Isaac to stay behind him, then slowly opened the cabin door. Cold mist pooled at the threshold. The barn stood about 20 paces away, its old wooden boards shuddering slightly, as if someone inside was pushing against them. But there was no sound, no movement, just the slow creak of wood settling. Pike took cautious steps toward it, revolver raised. Caleb, he called out. Son, if you're in there, you need to speak. Silence. Then, faintly, a whisper, barely audible, as though carried on a current of air. Not words, numbers. 7, 9, 7. But the voice wasn't Caleb's. Pike's skin prickled. Behind him, Corbett murmured, Dear God. Isaac surged forward, but the investigators held him back. Pike swallowed hard and nudged the barn door open. Inside, only darkness smelling of old hay and damp earth. A sliver of morning light spilled across the dirt floor. And there, etched into the soil in tight, perfect spirals, were the same symbols that appeared on Caleb's slate. Freshly drawn, as though completed merely seconds before they arrived. Sheriff, whispered one of the investigators, pointing to the far corner. Pike turned. A small wooden stool sat at an angle, its legs half buried in earth. No, not earth. In a shallow circular pit, as though something had spun itself into the ground with furious precision. Corbett exhaled shakily. This isn't the work of a child. No, Isaac said through clenched teeth. It's the work of someone who fears what the child might become." Pike didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something else, something he'd almost missed. A footprint, small, bare, pressed lightly into the soil near the barn door. Caleb's. But beside it, partially overlapping, was another print. Longer, narrower, unhuman. Eliza cried out when they showed her, her hands trembling so violently Pike had to steady her. "You see now?" Isaac said hoarsely, turning on Corbett. "You see why he wanders, why he doesn't sleep, why he hears what no man hears. Something's been following him." Corbett ran a hand down his face. "Or something he's been calling." The investigators took notes, their expressions unreadable. Eliza looked at the sheriff, eyes wet. "What does this mean? What's happening to my son?" Pike didn't have an answer. Because later that afternoon, as the town gathered to discuss the barn incident, more testimonies surfaced, each more unsettling than the last. A farmer swore he saw Caleb walking along the riverbank at dusk, but when he called out, the boy vanished behind a tree that couldn't have hidden a grown man, let alone a child. A seamstress reported finding her sewing needles arranged in geometric patterns one morning, patterns she recognized from the strange drawings in the woods. Most disturbing of all, the preacher from Hopewell Church claimed he found pages of his Bible rearranged overnight, forming new verses that made no sense, until he saw those same words carved into the bark of a tree near the march. The townspeople began speaking with fear, suspicion, and fascination interwoven. "It's the devil's work." "No, some kind of genius, a prodigy beyond our understanding." "He's cursed. He's chosen. He's dangerous. He's a victim." The tension in Ashford's Crossing became a living thing. Pike tried to calm the unrest, but even he felt the tremor beneath his ribs whenever someone mentioned Caleb's name. Corbett brought in more outsiders, scholars, men of science, and one stern-faced priest from New Orleans who claimed expertise in preternatural disturbances. They stayed in Corbett's estate and traveled together to the Johnson property, speaking in low, grave voices. People watched them from afar, and the rumors thickened like swamp fog. It was on the third night after the slate's discovery that the first eyewitness claimed to have seen Caleb, and something else. A young woman named Sarah Millstone burst into the tavern, pale and shaking, insisting she'd seen the boy standing at the edge of the river with a tall, shadowed figure beside him. She described it as a man, but stretched wrong. Its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally, as though listening to something far away. "When I called out to Caleb," she whispered, "they both turned. But the tall one, his face had no features, only darkness." Her voice cracked. And Caleb didn't look scared. He looked calm, like he knew it. The tavern erupted into uproar. Some called her a liar, others believed every word. Sheriff Pike rode to the river immediately with 2 deputies, but found nothing except the faint outline of 2 sets of footprints leading into the march, and none coming out. That night, Pike sat alone in his office, lantern flickering, staring at the locked drawer holding the slate. He whispered to himself, "Where are you, Caleb?" Outside, the wind rose sharply, rattling the shutters. Inside the drawer, something tapped. 3 times, softly, like a fingertip brushing wood. Pike closed his eyes. Fear had grown into something heavier, something with momentum, something unstoppable. And still, no one knew what Caleb Johnson truly was. A prodigy, a prophet, a warning, or something far more dangerous. What do you think? Guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Night fell over Ashford's Crossing like a velvet shroud. dense and swallowing, lit only by the ghost-blue shimmer that sometimes drifted through the shaded march. The town had entered a state of collective dread. Church bells rang at irregular hours. Doors were bolted before the sun touched the horizon, and neighbors whispered through cracks in shutters as if the darkness itself were listening. Sheriff Roland Pike found himself patrolling far more often than he slept. He kept his lantern bright and his revolver closer than prayer. Yet every night he felt the same sensation, like someone was standing directly behind him, breathing softly at the base of his skull. He'd whirl around, lantern raised high, but nothing would be there, only mist curling along the ground like a living thing. The investigators from Montgomery had taken up residence in Corbett's estate, turning the parlor into a makeshift command center. They spread maps, laid out sketches of symbols copied from the barn, and scribbled frantic theories into their journals. But each passing day made it clearer. They were guessing, blind, and running out of time. Then, on the 5th night after Caleb's disappearance, something happened that shook the town to its core. It began with a scream. Young Emil Carter, the blacksmith's apprentice, was running down Main Street, shouting for Sheriff Pike. His voice cracked with terror. "Barn!" he cried. "Behind the preacher's house. Something's in the barn." Pike sprinted, lantern swinging wildly, breath burning in his chest. When he reached the old barn, a small crowd had already gathered. Fearful, pale, rooted in place like cattle before a storm. Corbett arrived moments later with the investigators, their coats thrown over nightclothes, faces strained. Pike pushed through the crowd. "Clear a path! Move!" He stepped inside the barn, and everything stopped. It was cold, too cold for late autumn. A visible frost had crept up the support beams, glistening like spider silk in the lantern light. And in the center of the dirt floor, symbols. Hundreds of them, more intricate than any before. They spiraled outward in concentric patterns that interlocked like gears in a machine, far beyond human craftsmanship. The symbols glowed faintly, not blue, but white, pure and sharp, like bone reflecting moonlight. Pike whispered, "Dear Lord." One of the investigators stepped forward. "This is not natural. These carvings would have taken days, weeks." Corbett's voice trembled. "Unless someone, or something, didn't carve them with hands." Pike forced himself to walk toward the center of the spirals, afraid his footsteps would disturb whatever fragile boundary he was crossing. When he reached the innermost ring, he saw it. A message, written in perfect, careful script. "I hear them more clearly now." His heart lurched. "Caleb." The letter shimmered for a moment, then dimmed, fading into the dirt, as if they had only ever existed for those brave enough to see them. Eliza Johnson collapsed to her knees, wailing her son's name. Isaac gripped her tightly, his own breath breaking, though he refused to let his tears fall. Corbett stared, pale as a corpse. "We're not dealing with a gifted child. This is something else entirely. Something—" But he didn't finish, because suddenly, every lantern in the barn flickered. Darkness swept the rafters like a great wing passing overhead. The frost deepened. Then came the voice. A low, sonorous hum that grew into a vibration, rattling the beams, the tools, their bones. It was not human. It was not animal. It was frequency given intention, tone given shape. Eliza screamed. The investigator stumbled back. Pike felt his knees buckle for a moment, until he forced himself upright. The humming ceased. And then, from the darkness above, a single word echoed through the barn. "Sheriff." It was a whisper. A child's whisper. Pike froze. He turned slowly, lifting the lantern toward the rafters. Something shifted. A small shape crouched near the highest beam. Bare feet. thin limbs, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Caleb, Pike breathed. The child tilted his head, but not in recognition. More like curiosity or confusion, or perhaps assessment. Eliza rushed forward, but Isaac held her back with iron-tight arms. "Caleb!" she sobbed. "Baby, come down!" The figure in the rafters spoke again, but his voice twisted oddly, as though two tones overlapped, one higher than the other. "They are listening." Pike stepped forward. "Son, come on down from there. You're cold. You're tired. We'll take you home." Caleb blinked slowly. "No," he whispered. "Home is where they wait." Corbett whispered under his breath. "This is beyond scripture, beyond reason." Pike looked at the boy, really looked, and felt his stomach turn. Caleb's skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality. His hands were trembling slightly, though not with fear. His gaze flickered toward spaces where nothing stood. And then John saw the shadows. Indistinct shapes shifting at the barn's edges, long, thin structures like limbs sliding across the floor, recoiling each time the lantern light touched them. "Everyone stay back," Pike said. "Nobody move." Caleb climbed down the beam with unnatural ease, his movements fluid, unchildlike, as though gravity were an afterthought. When he touched the dirt floor, the symbols nearest him dimmed completely, vanishing into nothing. He raised his eyes. And for a brief instant, Pike saw something reflected in them. Not the barn, not the lanterns. A city, a towering sprawl of impossible architecture. Great spires bending into spirals, windows glowing with pale fire, walls carved with the same symbols now etched across Ashford's crossing. Then the vision vanished, leaving only the frightened face of a boy who didn't understand what he'd seen. Isaac broke free from the investigators and ran to his son, collapsing to his knees. "Caleb!" His voice cracked. "Please, please God, come back to us." Caleb stared at him, puzzled. "I never left." He reached forward and touched his father's cheek. And Isaac flinched back with a gasp, because Caleb's fingers were freezing, as cold as river ice. A gust of wind slammed the barn door shut. The lanterns flared, and the humming began again, this time louder, pulsing through the earth itself. The beams moaned. Dust cascaded from the rafters. Corbett shouted, "We have to get him out, now!" But Caleb shook his head slowly, mournfully. "It's too late." Eliza rushed forward, throwing her arms around her son. "No," she sobbed. "No, it's not." Caleb hugged her back with small, trembling arms and whispered into her ear, "They want to see you." Eliza's body stiffened. Pike grabbed her, pulling her backward, wrenching Caleb from her grasp. "What does that mean?" Pike demanded, voice shaking. Caleb looked at him. For the first time, the boy appeared frightened. "They followed me," he whispered. "They heard me thinking. I tried to close the door." The humming rose. Symbols across the barn began to glow again. The air thickened. Pike felt it pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Corbett screamed, "Get the priest!" But the priest had already fled. The investigators backed away, clutching their crosses, muttering prayers that dissolved into terrified babbling. The barn groaned. And then it happened. The floor erupted in light. Spiraling patterns of white etched themselves into the ground faster than the eye could follow. A column of pale brilliance surged upward, swallowing the center of the room, engulfing Pike, engulfing the boy, erasing the boundaries between the living world and something far older, far hungrier. Pike shielded his face, teeth clenched, eyes watering. He heard Isaac shouting, Eliza screaming. Corbett praying, and Caleb laughing, but not joyfully, not cruelly, desperately, like someone who understood something too late. The light snapped out. Darkness crashed down like a curtain. Silence. Pike opened his eyes slowly. The barn was still. The frost gone. The symbols erased. Eliza sobbing. Isaac kneeling. Corbett trembling. And Caleb gone. Only a faint footprint in the dirt remained. And beside it, a second one. Longer. Narrower. Pressed deeper into the earth, as if whatever made it weighed far more than a human being. Pike lifted the lantern with a trembling hand. "Dear Lord," he whispered, "what have we done?" A soft sound echoed behind him, like a breath, like a whisper, like something brushing the edge of the world. "If you stood in that room," the narrator's voice murmurs, "would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer." Ashford's Crossing woke the morning after with a dread so thick it felt woven into the fog. Word of the barn incident traveled faster than any rider could carry it. By sunrise, every household knew the same three things. Caleb Johnson was gone. Something else had stood beside him. And the ground itself had spoken. Though no one used the word supernatural aloud, the silence inside each home pulsed with the weight of it. Mothers held their children tighter. Men checked their rifles twice. Preachers walked the streets reciting scripture under their breath, not to comfort the townspeople, but to steady their own shaking hands. Sheriff Roland Pike barely slept. When he did close his eyes, he saw the spirals burning through the barn floor, saw Caleb's small figure standing inside the column of white, saw that tall, impossible shape behind him. He woke each time drenched in sweat, revolver already in hand, breath ragged. At dawn, he returned to the barn alone. The symbols were gone, erased so thoroughly, it looked as though the floor had been freshly turned. No frost, no footprints, no evidence of the impossible. Except one thing. At the center of the barn floor, half buried in the dirt, lay Caleb's slate. But now the symbols were different. Not spirals, not geometric languages, just a single sentence, carved with steady, deliberate hand. "I did not open the door." Pike closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. Then who had? The answer, he knew, would unravel him. News of Caleb's disappearance spread rapidly beyond Ashford's Crossing. Within 3 days, newspapers from Montgomery, Mobile, and Atlanta ran sensationalized headlines. "Unnatural child vanishes in strange circumstances." "Mysterious lights seen in Alabama town." "Gifted Negro boy missing. Locals speak of signs." Reporters flocked to the region, but Corbett's men denied all access. Anyone attempting to photograph the Johnson cabin or interview the family was turned away at gunpoint. Corbett wasn't protecting the Johnsons. He was protecting himself and the powerful families who now felt the situation slipping beyond containment. A committee of state officials convened in Montgomery within the week to discuss the disturbance. They met behind closed doors, but rumors leaked like steam through cracks. Some believed Caleb's disappearance posed a threat to regional stability. Others feared that if the full truth reached the national press, it would make Alabama appear superstitious and ungoverned. One phrase appeared repeatedly in leaked minutes. "Contain the narrative." Corbett was appointed liaison. Pike was summoned for testimony. He rode to Montgomery reluctantly, knowing the truth would be dismissed as delusion. But still, he told it. He described the frost, the humming, the glow, the footprints. When he finished, silence settled over the room. Then one official spoke, voice dry as old parchment. "Sheriff Pike, are you suggesting an entity not of this world removed the child?" Pike swallowed hard. I ain't suggesting anything, sir. I'm telling you what I saw. Another leaned forward. And do you still possess this slate? Yes, Pike said. We'll take custody of it. No, Pike replied. It stays with me. The room stiffened. Corbett's gaze hardened. Sheriff, be reasonable. Pike stared back. Reason left this matter the moment the boy vanished into light. They didn't argue. They didn't need to. That afternoon, Pike returned to his boarding room to find the door ajar and the slate gone. He didn't report it. He knew exactly who had taken it. Back in Ashford's Crossing, grief hollowed the Johnson family. Eliza rarely left her bed. Isaac spent hours staring at the wood's edge as though expecting those long, narrow footprints to reappear. Neighbors brought food, whispered prayers, offered condolences. But when Isaac opened the door to them, most couldn't look him fully in the eye. Everyone had an opinion about what happened, yet no one had the courage to say it aloud. Child was touched by God. Child was touched by the devil. Child brought something through. Child was taken so something worse wouldn't come. Isaac ignored them all. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, he walked to the shaded march alone. He stood in the stillness, waiting. "Caleb," he shouted. "Caleb, if you hear me, come home." Only the cicadas answered. "Finally," he whispered, voice cracking. "Whoever's got my boy, take me instead." The woods did not answer. But Isaac left that place with the certainty that he had been heard. The priest from New Orleans returned 10 days after the disappearance, having fled in terror the night of the barn incident. Shame burned in his eyes as he approached Sheriff Pike. "I deserted my duty," he said. "I owe you the truth." Pike crossed his arms. "Then speak." The priest lowered his voice. The symbols carved on the barn floor. They belonged to an order of languages known only in fragments. Ancient, pre-Abrahamic, believed to be used in rituals of communion. Communion with what? Pike demanded. The priest's hands trembled. Entities that dwell between realms. Things older than Scripture, older than creation as we understand it. Pike felt his stomach knot. "And you think Caleb called one of these things?" "No," the priest whispered. "I believe he kept them out as long as he could." The sheriff stared at him. "You're telling me the boy was a barrier?" The priest closed his eyes. "Or a bridge." Corbett's estate became the center of the cover-up. Investigators burned documents, confiscated personal journals, and forced anyone with eyewitness accounts to sign statements under threat of imprisonment. Newspapers were pressured to retract their stories. A revised account was issued. Child lost in river tragedy. Cause drowning. Body never recovered. Case closed. Corbett insisted on a public memorial service, not out of kindness but strategy, to shut the mouths of these still spreading unnatural rumors. The service was held at Hopewell Church. Pike and the Johnsons sat in the front row. Corbett delivered the eulogy with measured sorrow. He spoke of a gifted child lost too soon, of community unity, of the importance of accepting tragedy without giving in to superstition. But midway through his speech, Eliza rose to her feet. "No," she said softly. The crowd went still. Eliza stepped toward the pulpit, eyes burning. "My son didn't drown." Corbett's expression tightened. "Mrs. Johnson, please." She shook her head. "My son was taken." A murmur rippled through the congregation. "They took him because he was different, because he knew things he shouldn't, because he heard things you all feared." Her voice cracked, but she did not waver. "And now you want to bury him with the lies." Pike stepped toward her gently. Eliza. But she didn't stop. "If you want the truth buried," she whispered, turning her gaze upon Corbett, "you bury yourselves with it." Corbett motioned to his men, but no one moved, not even the investigators. For the first time, the powerful man looked afraid. But it wasn't Eliza he feared. It was the sudden shift in the air, the flicker of every candle in the church, the low hum vibrating through the wooden pews, the sound that every person recognized, though few had heard it directly. That same humming from the barn. People gasped. The candles dimmed, then extinguished. Screams erupted. Pike grabbed Eliza and Isaac, shoving them toward the exit. Outside, the sky churned with thick clouds, swirling unnaturally above the march. The trees bent as if pressed by unseen hands. Lightning flashed, white, spiraling, familiar. Isaac fell to his knees, sobbing. Eliza clutched her chest, whispering her son's name again and again. Pike stared into the woods, jaw clenched. And in the distance, far, far within the march, he saw it. A glow, blue-white, pulsing like a heartbeat. Caleb's heartbeat. "Sheriff," Isaac croaked, "tell me that ain't what I think." Pike didn't answer, because he didn't know. He only knew one thing. Caleb Johnson's story was not over. Not by a long shot. Ashford's Crossing would never forget. The state could bury the reports. The newspapers could issue retractions. Corbett could burn every scrap of evidence he collected. But the woods remembered. The earth remembered. And somewhere in the darkness between those spiraling trees, something else remembered it too. "So what do you believe?" the narrator whispers. "Was this truth unveiled, or buried to protect the powerful?" Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story.